Welcome back. Today I am going to start a new module titled motivation, an interesting and very energized topic that we are going to discuss about this term motivation. In this section we will talk about not only the meaning and definition, but some recent theories of motivation based on human behavior at work, where different aspects of behavior has been considered, that what behaviors can be captured enough to keep the employees motivated, perform well and reach their goal. So, getting more into details about different theories of motivation and motivational process or another process, let us first define that what is motivation. As a layman, everybody understands this term motivation, that how people can be motivated to perform better. This is a punchline of any management of any organization. But what is the psychology behind this process? So, motivation is a basic psychological process. There has to be some energy that is working behind every employee's performance. And what is this energy? This energy is psychological in nature and what drives an individual to work towards their goal. It is not only the monetary benefits that they get to work ahead. There is actually a psychological process that works from one step to another, and skipping any process or any step will not lead to motivation. So, how this process takes on, we are going to talk about in detail first of all. So, the term motivation has been derived from the Latin word mover, which means to move, and it is a driving force that initiates and directs behavior. What do you want? What exactly we want, then only we tend to think about that how I have to take the right course of action so that I can reach that goal. And in that whole process, there are behavioral transformations that take place based on some requirements or needs. Therefore, we can define motivation as the willingness to exert high levels of effort towards organized goals, conditioned by efforts and abilities to satisfy some individual needs. I need salary at the end of the month. For that, what I have to do? Definitely, I have to work. I want to have a high stake career. For that, I need to have appropriate qualifications so that I can take up that level of job. To take up that high stake job, person has to decide the course of action so that he becomes more able to reach that goal. This is a process of motivation, and there is some kind of need that triggers a person to take the action, engage in form of energy, reach the goal and then satisfy. So, when we talk about motivation, it is not only about reaching the goal or taking the action and then reach the goal, it is also about that what is the outcome after reaching the goal. So, there is a whole cycle that a person involves from time to reach the objective and experience that satisfaction. Again, we can define then motivation as a driving and pulling force which results in the persistent behavior directed towards a particular goal. As it is mentioned, driving and pulling force. What takes you towards that goal and to what extent the goal is pulling you towards himself or herself. So, it is both the ways, driving and pulling. You are directed towards the goal and the goal is pulling you towards itself. The point is that in the whole process, what is the outcome? You have reached the goal while taking the action. When you have reached the goal, what is the outcome? Whether you are satisfied or dissatisfied, whether there is reduction in the need or there is more requirement. So, in the whole process, we can say that this process of motivation requires certain elements which leads to the outcome. So, motivation is a process that accounts for an individual's intensity, direction and persistence of efforts towards attaining the goal. Now, all these three elements, if one element is missing, the motivational cycle remains incomplete. I will not say unsuccessful, but it remains incomplete and the person has to exert lot of efforts to meet all the three elements so that the cycle is complete. Therefore, the three key elements of motivation are intensity, direction and persistence. Intensity describes how hard a person tries. However, high intensity is unlikely to lead to favorable job performance until unless the effort is channelized in the direction that benefits the organization. The person who is employed needs promotion, that is fine, but maybe his efforts are not channelized in the right direction, in the right form that will lead him to the promotion. For that, he needs to combine his efforts with the right direction so that he can reach the goal. Now, even when the goal is defined, efforts are there, the strength is there, the intensity of the efforts is there and the direction is there, but if indulgence is not there, engagement is not there, that means persistence is not there, then also the person will find difficulty in reaching the goal. So, therefore, motivation has a persistent dimension which measures how long a person can maintain those efforts. It is not that in one instance when effort has been channelized and the goal is achieved. Maybe more instances are required, more time is required to invest in those efforts so that the goal can be achieved. So, intensity, persistence and direction, when all are working in sync and in continuation, then that cycle can be completed in terms of achievement of the goal and then understanding whether the goal is giving you satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Now, at the same time, the point is that even if we are motivated to achieve the goal, the motivation can also be other way around for not performing those behaviors which will lead to pain. So, in continuation to it, let us just first talk about how this process takes on. So, when we talk about motivation process, it starts with psychological or physiological deficiency. Whenever there is any need is required, then only that process starts. Until unless there is no need, the person is not motivated. This physiological deficiency can be related to hunger, thirst or body temperature, or it can be about psychological. Maybe we require compassion, we need to satisfy the sense of belongingness. When this need is initiated, the person becomes action oriented. There is some kind of energy that emits within the individual through his behavior, starts taking action, making plans to reach the goal. So, whenever need is being identified, it leads to a drive, that is, individual behaves in a certain manner. We make efforts to find solutions to satisfy a need. We are hungry, we will start looking for food. We are thirsty, we will start looking for water. We are feeling cold, we will start making efforts to maintain a very comfortable temperature in the room. We need to satisfy a sense of belongingness, we will try to find a compassionate partner with whom we can share. This is a drive which is full of action orientation and full of energizing thrust, which leads to incentive. So, need is there, when drive is also there, it leads to incentive, that is, person achieves a particular goal. So, what is the incentive? Need, when you are in driving state, where you are indulging in goal directed behavior, that you are looking for food, you are making efforts to search for food, you are making efforts to search for some water, you are making efforts to find a person with whom you can share your emotional problems, then ultimately leads to incentive in form of food. So, that is your goal. So, from that energy you reach your incentive or the goal, which is food, water or a friend or companion. So, this is an incentive. So, whenever need is there, which is created based on physiological or psychological deficiency, and there is a sense of imbalance. Imbalance means there is a sense of discomfort, that I am thirsty, I am uncomfortable, so I need water. So, whenever this need of water is there, the person is action oriented to find ways to look for water so that he can have it and maintain that balance. Drives and motives are the very heart of the motivational process, as they alleviate the need. Alleviate the need means reduce the tendency, reduce the need of water. So, as soon as you are engaging in that behavior to satisfy the need, the drive will also go down. Initially it is high because you are making efforts, you are in action orientation, and gradually you are reaching to the goal or the incentive. So, physiological or psychological drives are action oriented and provide an energizing thrust towards reaching an incentive. So, until unless we do not find water, food or any companion, we tend to make continuous efforts to reach that incentive. Whereas, incentives are defined that will alleviate the need and reduce the drive. Definitely, when we are having food, when we are having water, when we have a companion, then that desire starts lowering down. So, this is the incentive. So, this is alleviating the need and reducing the drive. Thus, attaining an incentive will tend to restore that balance and will reduce or cut off the drive. That is but obvious. that will help us to reduce the drive. Gradually when we are eating food, it will lead to satiation. We are hungry, action is high, we are looking for food, we are preparing food. When we are prepared with the food, we are eating, gradually that drive will reduce and we are maintaining that balance. So, this is how this whole process cycle will take place. Now, as soon as we reach incentive and the need is alleviating, the drive is reducing and we are finding that balance. This balance is known as homeostasis. This is the outcome which leads to satisfaction, that is homeostasis. Thus, attaining an incentive will tend to restore physiological psychological balance and will reduce or cut off the drive. So, as soon as the drive is reduced or is cut off, it leads to a balance which is known as homeostasis. The examples are our food and water are translated into hunger and thirst drives, and the need for friends becomes a drive for affiliation or sense of belongingness. So, it is both the ways, physiological and psychological. Now, what is this cycle? Just now we have talked about process, need, drive and incentives. Now, how this process is again forming into a cycle. It is not only that need is there, we are action oriented, we are driving towards that goal and the incentive is there. No, in between there are some more behavioral changes that we can observe. So, when an internal driving state is aroused, based on the need, the individual is pushed to engage in behavior that will lead to a goal that reduces the intensity of the driving state. That is what we have understood, right. At least reaching that appropriate goal which reduces the driving state is pleasurable and satisfying. That is what I said. As soon as we start eating food, we are reaching a level of satiation, that is state of balance or homeostasis, which will give us satisfaction, food, water or companion, and thus we are satisfied. So, we can say that whenever any motivation process is initiated, it leads to a cycle where there is a driving state which is full of action orientation or energizing thrust is there. The person indulges in goal directed behavior which is initiated by the driving state definitely, and there is attainment of appropriate goal or the incentive. The reduction of the driving state and subjective satisfaction and relief when the goal is reached. Now, the point is that even when the goal is reached, we have to assess to what extent we are satisfied, and then only that homeostasis will also be balanced, whether it leads to satisfaction or dissatisfaction or certain level of relief. So, after a time again a new need is there and again the driving state builds up again to push the behavior towards the goal. Now, in this process in cycle, the need is pushing the behavior in another direction and at the same time the incentive, the goal is also pulling the behavior. So, it is a pushing and pulling behavior. So, need for food to satisfy hunger, we are pushing our behavior towards food, and food is pulling the behavior of an individual which will lead to satisfaction or homeostasis. So, therefore, after a time the driving state builds up again to push behavior towards the appropriate goal, and the sequence of events just described is sometimes called the motivational cycle. So, as per the diagram in the corner, when need is there, there is a driving force, there is arousal. This arousal is actually the energizing thrust. This is another kind of process in the process itself. It leads to goal directed behavior, that is the driving state. There is an achievement, that is we have reached the goal. There is reduction of arousal and again a new need is aroused. So, this is how the motivational cycle is created. So, we cannot say that it is only the process in terms of need, drive and incentive. In between the whole process, another cycle is also working where there is arousal, where there is achievement, and at the same time there is reduction of arousal or the drive. Apart from it, motivation is a push and pull process, as I mentioned just now. Certain characteristics of the goal pull behavior towards them. The goal motivate behavior and are known as incentives. Whatever the incentive is based on the need, we are pushing our behavior to those incentives. But the important part is that we are motivated towards the goal because we know that whenever we will reach the goal, it is going to give us pleasure and satisfaction, right. But there are times when we are motivated not to reach that incentive because or the goal because the incentive is negative. So, we will not indulge in those kind of behaviors that motivate us to perform any wrong behavior and the goal or the outcome is negative. So, the important part of many incentive is that individuals expect pleasure from the attainment of what are called positive incentives and the avoidance of pain, what is known as negative incentives. So, motivation also takes a hedonistic view. So, based on positive incentives and negative incentives, it is a natural tendency of an individual that the person is motivated to experience pleasure and is motivated to avoid pain. So, this is the another hedonistic perspective of the whole motivational process, that an individual is motivated to seek goals that give us good emotional feelings, which gives us more satisfaction and pleasure and comfort, and avoid those resulting in displeasure, pain or discomfort. So, it is not only motivation to experience pleasure, motivation is also there to avoid again displeasure or discomfort. So, this is how the motivation cycle and process goes hand in hand. Next comes types of motives. So, there are two kinds of motives, primary motives and secondary motives. The major difference between these two motives is that primary motives are unlearned and they are physiological in nature, whereas secondary motives, they are learned and they are psychological in nature. So, therefore, primary motives are unlearned and they are physiological in nature. The primary motives are vital for survival. Nobody can survive without satisfying those primary motives, such as hunger, thirst, sleep, avoidance of pain and seeking pleasure. These are such motives that if we tend to fail to satisfy these needs or motives, then our survival becomes difficult. Nobody can remain hunger, nobody can survive without water, nobody wants to enjoy any kind of pain, for example, standing in cold temperature without thermals. This is a natural requirement of any body that you need to put on thermals to avoid cold temperature. These are natural instincts which becomes primary in nature because they help us to survive in any surrounding. Whereas secondary motives, they are unquestionably learned and psychological in nature, and these are closely tied to the learning concepts, in particular the learning principle of reinforcement. Anything we require, we make efforts as we know that we will apply our knowledge, skills and abilities and different kind of learnings and skills to achieve the goal. So, this is very much psychological in nature. Some of the most important secondary motives are need for power, need for achievement and need for affiliation. So, in addition, there are some other secondary drives, for example, security and status. This is something that people will make utmost efforts to satisfy these motives and engage in behaviors while enhancing their performance or learning new skills in order to satisfy these kind of motives. So, when we talk about primary motives, no learning is required, but yes, when we talk about secondary motives, they are learned and they are psychological in nature and they impact human behavior to a larger extent. These are the examples of some secondary needs we can just go through. For example, need for achievement. It is such as what kind of behaviors we see in terms of motivation to need for achievement, doing better than competitors, solving a complex problem, attaining or surpassing a difficult goal or carrying out a challenging assignment successfully. Need for power, how a person is motivated to satisfy the need for power, influencing people to change their attitudes or behavior, being in a position of authority over others and defeating an opponent or enemy. Need for affiliation, being liked by many people while becoming more compliant, working with people who are friendly and cooperative and participating in pleasant social activities. Then we have need for security, to have a secure job, having protection against illness and disability and avoiding tasks or decisions with a risk of failure and blame. And need for status, having the right car and wearing the right clothes, having a degree from the right university or the top university and having executive privileges. So, these adds to the status. So, these are the secondary motives which trigger human behavior to engage in that energizing thrust or behavior which help them to reach their goals in order to satisfy the need for power, achievement, affiliation, status or security. At the same time, motives can be intrinsic and extrinsic in nature. So, what are intrinsic, which are very much insidious? These are internally generated. For example, motivators that the person that they are motivators that a person associates with the task or job itself. So, you are attached to your job internally, which is very much in terms of to what extent any job will give you recognition, what you can achieve in your job, to what extent you consider your job to be meaningful, that you are able to contribute to the organization and the society, or what kind of challenges you experience, you face when you are performing a job. So, these are the intrinsic motives that a person tend to handle or take charge of those aspects of the job which are very much internal based on the perception of an individual, and then engage in behaviors that satisfy these motives. So, these can be intrinsic rewards such as sense of responsibility, achievement, accomplishment, something was learned from an experience, feelings of being challenged or competitive, or that something was an engaging task or goal. So, therefore, performing meaningful work has long been associated with intrinsic motivation. So, this is something which is not mentioned anywhere in anybody's job. It is something what you experience when you become attached to your tasks you have to perform, and what are those internal rewards, and you perform best and you are being recognized, you are being rewarded with some bonus annually. So, this is something very much intrinsic which motivates a person to perform better more in future. The other is extrinsic motives. These motives are tangible and visible to others. They are distributed by other people. Other people here are the agents within the organization who tend to distribute those motives to others in form of promotion, in form of benefits, in form of bonuses, in form of pay. So, this is something a person can feel. These are the tangible benefits that are very much apparent. People can see it in a very hardcore manner. So, extrinsic motives include the drive to avoid punishment such as termination or being transferred. Now, these are something that when person knows that if the job performance goes low, maybe he will not receive the bonus. So, this is something very much clear and apparent to every employee, and they are more focused on those extrinsic rewards. They are usually contingency based. So, extrinsic rewards or motives are contingency based, that better the performance, better are the rewards, financial rewards. The performance goes down, then the bonus will also goes down. So, the intrinsic motivator is contingent on improved performance that is superior to others in the same workplace. It is not necessary also that extrinsic motivators will attract people to the organizations. So, they are also often used to inspire workers to achieve at higher levels or to reach new goals, as additional payoffs are contingent upon improved performance. The difference is that extrinsic rewards will never attract employees towards the organization, but yes, intrinsic rewards or intrinsic motives will definitely attract people towards a particular organization, because a person that will give some internal or intrinsic satisfaction to an individual. So, this is the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motives. Next comes the importance of motivation. It is such an important aspect to be discussed when we are talking about organizational behavior, because managers strive to motivate employees in organization to perform at higher levels, definitely. So, this means getting them to work hard and make positive contributions to the organization. But how? How it is important and how it is possible every time to make the employees work hard and contribute to the organization. So, there at this point, this process of motivation carries lot of significance, because it is not only about an individual responsibility to feel motivated or become motivated. It is also the organization's responsibility to make the employees motivated based on certain factors. Therefore, job performance depends on ability and environment as well as motivation, and this relationship has to be established in any organization. So, according to OB professionals, performance of any employee is based on three factors. The first is motivation plus ability plus environment, where P stands for performance, M stands for motivation, A stands for ability, and E stands for environment. So, according to OB professionals, any performance can be enhanced when motivation levels, ability of an individual and environment of the organization are in sync, and the person as an employee is able to perform at high levels and contribute to the organizations. Therefore, to reach high levels of performance, the employee must have the desire to perform well, which is actually the motivation based on the intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. He must be able to do the job effectively, which is contingent upon an individual's ability, knowledge, skills, abilities and all the information, correct information that an employee possesses to execute his job, and most importantly must have all the materials, resources, equipment and information required to perform the job, which constitutes the work environment. It also constitutes about the workplace safety and security. The more workplaces are secure and comfortable, the more the person is motivated to perform at higher levels. So, performance on overall becomes enhanced only when motivation, ability and environment are in sync, and finally it leads to enhanced performances. Deficiency of any of the factor may be in terms of motivation, ability or environment. The manager will not be able to enhance performance, rather the performance is being impaired. Therefore, a manager should thus strive to ensure that all three conditions are met. So, this is about the meaning, definition, the process, the different kinds of motives and the importance of motivation we have discussed in this section. That is all for today. In the next section, we will discuss about some more contemporary theories of motivation in detail. Thank you so much.